In this video, we are going to talk about how to spice up your dominant chord or your 5 chord in the context of any key. Now, we're going to utilize examples utilizing C major to keep things simple in this video, but these principles will apply to whatever key you might be writing a song in, just utilizing that 5 or dominant chord. So just to make sure we're on the same page with what a dominant chord is or what a 5 chord is, let's talk about what that means. Basically, just in any major or minor key, you are going to have 7 total scale degrees. So to take C major, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. And then, of course, back to C, but that would be the 8th one. So there's 7 total scale degrees. Or say in D major, we have D, E, F sharp, and then we have G, A, B, C sharp before going back to D. So what a 5 chord means is it just means it's the triad that is built off of the 5th scale degree. So in C major, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So then we build our triad, our chord off of that 5. We have a G major chord. So G major in the context of C major would be the 5 chord or the dominant chord, because dominant chord means the same thing. It's built off the 5th scale degree. And then for D major, for instance, that would be our A major chord, because we have D would be the 1, 2 would be E, 3 would be F sharp, then G, and A would be our 5th scale degree. In G major, it would be D major. So how can we change up our dominant chord or our 5 chord, which is arguably the most prevalent chord in any given song, tied probably with the 4 chord and possibly the 1 chord, depending on the song. But those are the 3 certainly most overall common chords. So how can we make that 5 chord, that dominant chord, a little more interesting, which is going to be our G major chord in the context of C major? One way is simply changing the inversion. Now, we talked about changing the inversion in one of the last videos where we talked about changing the inversion for the 1 chord. But changing the inversion for the 5 chord is going to have sort of a different job, because while changing the inversion for the 1 chord usually made it so that normally the 1 chord sounds very resolved, but instead changing the inversion made it sound less resolved. And of course, there's more to it, but that is a good reason, certainly, to change the inversion, and is one benefit. But for the 5 chord, we don't have to worry about it sounding resolved, because the 5 chord is probably the least resolved sounding chord that we have, because, well, it's the dominant chord and it most badly wants to go to the 1 chord. We don't have time to get into all that. But so just as a quick recap on inversions, inversions are really just defined by whatever the lowest note is. So if you have a G major chord, but then the lowest note is the B, which is technically the 3rd of your G major chord, not your root, that would be defined as first inversion. And then if you use the 5th, that would be the 2nd inversion. So first, let's talk about that first inversion. Something that first inversion can get us is the first inversion of our 5 chord actually gets us the 7th scale degree in the bass, which is important because the 7th scale degree is something that you are probably never going to have in the bass when it comes to being the root of your chord. Now, the reason for that is the 7th scale degree chord naturally occurring in a major key is going to be a diminished chord, which is pretty rarely used. So you're usually not going to, say, go from a C major chord to a B diminished chord. That just almost never happens. And for that matter, you're probably not going to go from any chord in C major to a B diminished chord. It's very rarely used. But you may want to still have that B in the bass, especially if you're trying to, say, do a descending bass line, something like that, right? So in that case, you're basically never going to be utilizing that B diminished chord. So a great way to get that 7th scale degree in your bass, maybe you have a bass line that utilizes that scale degree, whatever it might be, a great way to do it is simply using that first inversion 5 chord. Now, technically, 2nd inversion 3 chord would also accomplish this, but the 3 chord, unfortunately, is probably the 2nd most rare of the naturally occurring triads in a key. By pretty much all accounts, your 3 most common are your 1, 4, and 5. Which order those are in depends who you ask. The 6th chord is almost definitely the most common of the minor triads that are in a key. And then a 2 chord is the other minor chord that's used fairly often, but that 3 chord is probably the most rarely used, which it shouldn't be, because I love that chord. It's fantastic. But for whatever reason, it's not used as much. So a great way to have a descending bass line where maybe you go from the 1 to now you're doing a 5 chord, but you have first inversion, and then you can just do a regular A minor and then a regular root position G major chord, and there's your descending bass line. And then we also have second inversion. So for second inversion, this can be a great way to get an ascending bass line instead of a descending one where maybe we start again with C, and then we want to go to D, and then we could go to E, F, G, and I made different choices for, you know, what chord to have on top, which isn't really relevant, except that we start with root position, and then if we want to have a major chord, but still have a D in the bass, utilizing that second inversion G major chord, which again would be the 5 chord in the context of C major, can be a great way to go. Now, if you wanted to have minor tonality, then yeah, sure, you can just go from the 1 chord to the 2 chord, which is going to be a minor chord. But very often you might not want that. You may want to keep it a G major chord, but you do want that ascending bass line. And then say for the E, you don't want to use E minor. Instead, you want to do C major first inversion, and then an F major chord, and then a G major chord. So you can have basically an ascending bass line that utilizes notes in your bass line that normally would be associated with minor chords, but actually make them major just by changing up the inversion. Again, C major, G major, just second inversion, and then C major again, but first inversion, and then first inversion, or sorry, not first inversion, root position, F major chord, and then we just have root position G major chord. And then you technically could do the bass line all the way up and keep it all major chords if you wanted to. So another great way to spice up your 5 chord, your dominant chord, is simply by utilizing the tonic in the bass. Now, this is not an inversion because our tonic does not naturally occur in our dominant chord. If we take our dominant chord in C major, we have a G major triad, as we've talked about before, which has a G, a B, and a D. And our tonic is a C. So that is not naturally occurring. But this can be a great way to either incorporate a pedal tone in your song, which is a great way to really give your song a just beautiful sounding harmony with almost no effort whatsoever. But this also can just be a great way to make your G chord in the context of C major, aka your 5 chord in whatever key that you may be writing in. It can be a great way to spice it up, make it more interesting. So for frame of reference, I'm going to do just a 1-5-4-5 chord progression, which in the context of C major means I'm going to be doing a C, then G, and then F, and then back to G, back to C, and go through it all over again. But we just keep C in the bass because that's our tonic. See how, like, it's so simple, but it makes it way more interesting than this. Compare that to this. And this is keeping the same note in the bass. All right, so there's just a simple example, but overall, this sound of having that tonic in the bass with your 5 chord is a great way to make it sound way more exotic and interesting than normally it would be. I think it's a really beautiful sound. Just in general, your chords start to sound more interesting once you are getting towards 4 chord tones, which at this point we do have 4 because we have our G major triad, but we also have an added tone. So simply utilizing your tonic in the bass for your dominant chord can be a great way to spice it up. Another way to spice up your 5 chord is by making it a 5 sus4 chord. Now, a sus4 chord also sometimes is just marked as just a sus chord because whenever we see sus chord, the implication is that it would be a sus4 chord unless otherwise specified. So for instance, if it's a sus2 chord, it will usually say sus2. If it just says sus, that usually implies sus4. But regardless, one of the reasons that this can be a great way to spice up your chord is, again, back to that pedaling concept. This can be a great way to incorporate that tonic into your chord, because when we have a G major sus4 chord, we are replacing that B with instead a C, and our C is our tonic note. So this can be really effective, for instance, if you want to have a pedal tone, again, as we sort of talked about with the bass note, and you really want to hammer home, hey, this is in the key of C major. So for instance, if we just do a 1, 5, 6 chord progression, but instead of our 5 chord being a traditional 5 chord, we instead make it a sus4 chord, that would actually leave it so that we actually have a C note in our whole progression. So we start with a C major chord, and then a G major, that is sus4. So we stayed on this C still, and then we have our A minor, and then, hey, you can even go to a 4 chord, and it still keeps that C that entire time. And this can be especially helpful if you want to pedal on that C tone, on that tonic, and have a chord progression around it, because basically all of your other main chords, which are the 1, 4, 5, and 6, the 1, 4, and 6 all utilize that tonic, right? So our 1 chord obviously uses the 1, our 4 chord also uses the 1, and our 6 chord also utilizes the 1. Or if you want to see it this way, 1, 4, utilizing that one, and then 6, the third, would be our tonic. So our 5 chord is the only one that doesn't. But if we change it to a sus4, then even that one is also utilizing our tonic. Another side nice thing about this is just by changing the bass note, you actually are changing the entire chord that this is. So for example, in this context, this is a G major sus4 chord because we have G in the bass. But if we actually change it to have the 1 in the bass, this is sort of going back to what we talked about in the last video for utilizing a sus2 chord for your 1 chord. But this now is actually just a 1 sus2 chord, because now it's basically a C major. We have C, C, and G, and then we have that suspended second without that major third that would normally be in a C major chord. So just by changing the bass note, we went from this is a C major sus2, and this is a G major sus4. And lastly, there is the dominant 7th chord, which is a very special 7th chord for many reasons, but one of those reasons is simply that it might be the single most tension-filled chord that you can have that really, really badly wants to resolve to your 1 chord, to your tonic chord. And the reason for this is already of the main triads that you get in a major key, the one that most wants to resolve to your 1, to your tonic, is the 5 chord. One of the reasons for this is if we just take our G major chord, you'll notice that it has this B in it. And B is what you would call a leading tone. It's the primary leading tone of the entire key. Why? Because it is simply a half step away from your 1, from your tonic. So it so badly wants to resolve to that 1. Just for frame of reference, there's that leading tone, right? So it really badly wants to do that. So our 5 chord already has that. It has the leading tone of the entire key, the main one that most badly wants to resolve to the 1, to the tonic. So that is one of the main reasons why it has so much tension already. But then if we make it our dominant 7th chord, it really doubles down on that concept, because now not only do we have this B that really wants to resolve to the C, but we have this F now that is a semitone or half step from the 3rd of our tonic chord. So now we have basically the B that wants to resolve to the C, and then the F that really wants to resolve to the E. So in our major key, or in a minor key for that matter, you only have 2 half steps, right? So we have C, whole step to D, whole step to E, half step to F, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then half step. So the only 2 half steps we have are between, in C major, E and F, and then C and B. And our dominant 7th chord utilizes both of those. So we have that B that wants to go to the C, and then the F that wants to go to the E. So because of that, we have that ultra, like, wow, very resolved sound to it. And this really creates tension that just so badly wants to be resolved to that because we're utilizing both of the leading tones in our key. And another thing that makes this dominant seventh special is that it has what's called a tritone. A tritone is just one semitone less than a perfect fifth. So for example, a perfect fifth would be something like this, where we have a G to a D, but this would be a tritone, or this would be a tritone. So back to our G dominant seventh chord, between our third and our seventh, we actually have a tritone, which is a part of why it sounds so dissonant, and also adds to why it wants to be resolved so badly, because this is a very dissonant interval. It either wants to go or something like that, right? It doesn't, this is very unstable sounding, unlike a perfect fifth, which is incredibly stable sounding. Right, that sounds very stable. This does not sound stable. So we have a naturally occurring in our dominant seventh chord tritone between the B and the F. Another way to look at this is we talked earlier about how that diminished seventh chord is basically not useful at all. This actually contains that diminished seventh chord that sounds so gnarly. Now, we have the G added in this, which ultimately makes it just that G dominant seventh chord, but we have the entire triad of a B diminished chord. And really why a diminished chord is so gnarly sounding is because of that tritone between the first and the fifth. So your dominant chord is utilizing both of the half steps in your key that really make it want to very badly resolve down to one. So especially if you're getting to a point in your song where you want to add a lot of tension and make it really want to pull to one, whether you actually do end up going to one and giving people's ears what they want, or whether you utilize that to add a lot of tension by making somebody want that to happen, and then you don't go there. So just utilizing that dominant seventh chord can be a great way to add a ton of tension, especially if you want to relieve that tension by going to the one chord, or really dial up the tension by not giving the listener's ear what they want, which is to go to that one, but instead go somewhere else. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, something else you'll likely find helpful is my free guide on the 4 pillars of music theory that I think every songwriter really needs to know. A lot of people falsely think that music theory is just academic knowledge and it's not actually useful, and I think that thought comes from how many people simply think that music theory is being able to read sheet music, and it has nothing to do with that at all. And I would argue that sheet music can be useful, but I would actually agree with people who say it's not useful specifically for songwriting. And I know how to read sheet music, but when it comes to songwriting, I never write it down. But music theory is super helpful for songwriting, and specifically at least these 4 pillars will get you 90% of the way there. You may have heard of the 80-20 rule. This is sort of the 80-20 rule of music theory. There's tons of music theory that's super helpful for songwriters, in my opinion. But if you want 80% of the results from 20% of the learning, and in this case, way less than 20% of the learning, if you want to take the 2% of knowledge of music theory that'll get you 80% of the results, so it's even better than the 80-20 rule, then these are the 4 things to learn, and those are intervals, keys, chords, and chord progressions. So if you're interested, be sure to check that out. Link in the description down below. It's at songwritertheory.com/music theory guide. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.